thank you very much, Omar, for the kind introduction. So we have 30 minutes for this session, and before we go into the panel discussion, allow me to give a quick overview of the topic. So the topic here is on nature-based solutions for a net zero transition. And it is very interesting to note that back in 2022, last year, there was a very interesting landmark decision by the United Nations Environment Assembly, where it formally recognized nature-based solution, or in short, NBS, and allow me to define it here, because I think this long definition is of interest, and it encapsulates a lot of key components, both environment and from a social and climate perspective. So the definition is defined as actions to protect, conserve, restore, and sustainably use and manage natural and modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems, which then address social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience and biodiversity benefits. This is a long definition, and I think there's a reason for it to be long because of the importance and the diversity and the comprehensiveness of nature as a whole. But having said that, nature-based solution needs to be implemented with specific standards and criteria, just like in the case of carbon credit, where the integrity is of importance. And at the same time, nature-based solution needs to be inclusive and transparent and developed with regard to land rights and respect to local community and local indigenous community and people. So today we have two esteemed panelists with us to talk about NBS, but interestingly from an angle of net zero transition and with a focus of ASEAN, if appropriate. And two of our panelists are from the UK and Singapore, and allow me to give a brief overview of their profile. So Gail is a director of advisory at Finance Earth, which is a mission-driven social enterprise working in partnership with world's leading environmental organization to both protect and restore nature, utilizing market-based mechanism and implementing bespoke financial tools. She has been in the sustainable finance and international developmental space since 2004 and has held senior advisory roles in the UN, namely the UNDP and the World Food Programme. She has also worked as an independent advisor and researcher for philanthropic foundations and the non-profit sector. She served as a fellow with the development initiatives between 2019 and 2021, which is a leading development organization in the UK. And she currently serves on the global steering group of the Global Ethical Finance Initiative and the Board of Jubilee in Scotland. Olivier, on the other hand, serves as the head of ASEAN, Japan, Australia ESG Solutions at S&P Global Sustainable1. He leads the Sustainable1 ESG Solutions team in the region, where he focuses on strategic development of the S&P Global ESG Solutions. So prior to joining the S&P, Olivier worked over 11 years in the financial industry, and his most recent position was co-head of the ESG Solution team at Natixis Investment Manager Solutions, where he focused on the development of climate analytical and data capacities. And before that, he was working for the Natixis CIB and Natixis Investment Managers in solutions advisory roles in London and Paris. An interesting career initiation was that he used to work on funding water and environment projects in West and East Africa. So we have two esteemed panelists with broad range of expertise and experience, and I trust that the discussion will fully be insightful and meaningful. Right, without further ado, let me start off with some opening questions for both the panelists. So Gail, so you have been in this space for a while, and we have been listening to a lot of challenges such as financing gap for nature. So how do we close this financing gap? Some have claimed to up to trillions of dollars for nature. And what are the main channels in which projects on the ground can attract financing?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. So look, Adam, you talked in your introduction there about the importance of nature. So we know that it matters, right? But the reality is that we're not investing in it in the way we need to. I think it's useful to put the scale of the financing gap for nature into context as we start today. And according to the UN Environment Programme, we're looking at a 700 billion annual financing gap for nature globally. And the UN estimates that investments in nature need to increase fourfold by 2050. So we are far from where we need to be in terms of investing in nature. And if you look at the ASEAN region specifically, it is home to some of the world's most unique biodiversity on the planet. So from the rainforests of Southeast Asia to the reefs of the Coral Triangle, but it's also among the world's regions which are suffering the most rapid biodiversity loss due to a variety of pressures, from population growth to rapid urbanization and so on. So in ASEAN, we do need much more investment in nature, and we need to recognize that. I think the good news is that we have seen a huge shift in consciousness recently within the financial sector about the importance of investing in nature. I think the COP15 summit recently in Montreal provided additional impetus to that. We've seen a recognition that it's not just about net zero investing, that we need to see nature positive investing as well, and that financial institutions need to play their part in accelerating this shift. But of course, we need to translate that momentum, which is fantastic, and that shift in consciousness, that goodwill, into the availability of finance and resources in practical terms on the ground. So how do we do that? I would say that there are two key areas here to enable some of that finance to reach where it's needed most in nature. And I think the first area is around investment readiness. If projects are to attract private repayable capital, they need to generate stable, predictable revenue streams. And let's remember that most nature-based projects have traditionally been funded through grant financing, and project developers are only just starting to explore how they might be able to monetize the ecosystem services that nature-based projects provide, whether that's through carbon or biodiversity or anything else. But to explore that, they need investment readiness support to identify those revenue streams, model them, identify buyers and of those ecosystem services and so on. So it's a very, very different approach and journey for them. And I think the second area is that public sector and philanthropic funds can be used in a much more catalytic and strategic way to crowd in private finance. So we see that nature projects are very much new to many financial institutions and investors. It's not necessarily an area that they feel comfortable in or knowledgeable about. But if public and philanthropic capital can be used to reduce perceived risk of those projects, for example, through taking a first loss position in a nature-themed fund, then that can act as a powerful incentive to the private sector to invest. So I think doing more across both those areas would help us to accelerate the journey in terms of bringing more private capital into nature.
Yeah. I mean, you've raised very good points on blended finance that capitalize both on the public-private funding, and I think what is of interest is to see more of these projects in regions such as ASEAN, where we have quite a number of mega biodiverse countries or even hotspots. So thanks for highlighting those key elements. We'll move to Olivier on something a bit more conceptual, but it is very important in the sense that although it may not be fully quantifiable, but conceptually it makes a lot of sense. Right? So there's this concept of double materiality, and why is it important in the context of nature?
Thanks, Adam, and thanks. Very happy to be having this opportunity to speak with you here today. Basically, I'm coming back to what you were saying earlier about how we are leading this conversation about nature to a net zero transition, and what Gail was saying about, we're moving from net zero to actually being nature positive. And I see this as, the way, Gail mentioned about investments, and really what I wanted to focus on is the flip side of that aspect, which is the risk aspect. You have the opportunities, you have how do you enhance and find funding for those nature positive investments. And the other aspect is how do we assess risks? And that's where the double materiality is important. Because risks go both ways, right? How, as let's say, a company that invests in any investment, how is that investment first dependent, so vulnerable to to impact, to risk on nature? How is the supply chain dependent on the degrading ecosystem environment? That's the risk that the company, the investment, is facing. And the other side is the more traditional one, is what is the risk, the negative impact that company, that investment might have on the environment. So you have both materialities, as we say. You have something very similar in the ESG world. I think it's very critical to this discussion to have both elements, and these elements of let's summarize it as being dependencies and impact, right? Both ways. How is a company dependent on nature services, and how is this company impacting nature in terms of risks, are at the heart of the TNFD approach, the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure, which is, again, if we go back to the net zero analogy, let's say TNFD is to net zero, TCFD is to net zero what TNFD is to nature positive. Having, unlocking a situation or an environment where capital is getting available means a change in mindset. So all, the Montreal discussions and all these evolutions mean that not only are we looking at project level information for positive contribution, but also integrating nature considerations into the main major financial flows, so that consideration, the same way that net zero has become a key, feature, a key lens in all investment capabilities, we're seeing the same movement with nature, with biodiversity, with this TNFD enhanced, or let's say tilted approach, which is very much a risk approach, but helps getting this capability to then free up, lock up capital for a nature positive investment framework globally. So that's something that we think is very critical, and is the flip side of that investment unlocking discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Olivier. You certainly raised a very important development on the space of the TNFD disclosure. But the double material has always been there in terms of the as a concept. But just that now we're seeing increasingly more data providers and analysts to kind of quantify the so-called impact and dependency when it comes to nature risks. And it's good to share the flip side from a risk perspective, and while Gail raises the opportunities. But so building on these points, Gail, if I were to move to you, what are the unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to nature finance, generally speaking, globally from your experience? But then if you have any experience in the context of ASEAN, that would be also very interesting.
Thanks, Adam. I think on the challenges side, that Oliver talked about this change of mindset. And I think the reality is that the integration of nature is just so new to many financial institutions. So they need to build their internal knowledge and capacity across in a variety of ways to understand the risks to them, but also the opportunities to invest in nature as well. And I think what we've seen, unfortunately, is that weak environmental regulation within the ASEAN region has unfortunately meant that large amounts of lending have actually put nature at risk. So we need to flip that and make sure lending is nature positive rather than does the opposite. At the same time, on the opportunity side, the opportunities are massive for the ASEAN region. Increasing urbanization, rapid expansion of infrastructure, the size and population density of Asia Pacific means that there are massive environmental, social dividends if we can get this right. So the Asia Pacific region really has the most to gain from getting this right, but the most to lose if it gets it wrong as well. And I think there are also several global financial hubs within the ASEAN region as well, which really do have the financial muscle to fuel a shift within the region. And if those financial institutions can proactively manage flows of capital towards nature positive outcomes, that will have a massive positive impact, I think. In terms of like how we balance the economic development imperative with the importance of protecting nature, I think, look, at Finance Earth, our approach has always been to very much put communities at the center, because it's only when you put local communities at the center of decision making when it comes to nature-based projects can you be assured of their long-term success and the sustainability of that project over time. And I think we need to stop thinking of nature restoration and development as trade-offs, because we see in our work just how much nature restoration contributes to more and better livelihoods opportunities for local communities. So, for example, some of the work that we're doing with WWF, with your organization, Adam, actually in Africa, but on mangrove restoration, is not only protecting nature, but is leading to an increase in the abundancy and variety of fish species, leading to new opportunities in fisheries, sustainable aquaculture, communities also benefiting from carbon revenues, biodiversity uplift as well. So I think the key takeaway here is that there doesn't need to be, and there isn't, a trade-off between development and nature, and that actually nature restoration supports a better quality of development.
Yeah, I like the point that you raised. You coined the word social environmental dividend. This is something very interesting because it has a dollars and cents kind of connotation, but also from a capital standpoint, a social nature capital. I think you also raised a very important point, both life and livelihood. So a couple of years ago, the ILO, International Labour Organization, WWF, we did a study on how nature-based solutions can create more green jobs. So there are a lot of proven case studies and so on, and it shouldn't be seen as a trade-off. So thanks for highlighting that. So maybe I can deep dive a bit on your work, Finance. I know you have mentioned some example in Africa. But what are the key lessons that you can draw, both in terms of key success factors and also key stumbling blocks that you have found so far?
Oh, thanks, Adam. So look, we work both in the UK and internationally, and we work across several regions globally. We would love to do more in the ASEAN region. So for all those watching today and are interested in our work, we're always on the lookout for more partners. So please do be in touch if you're interested in our work. I mean, I think a few key lessons from our journey so far. The first is that I think that one reality we have to work with is that many nature-based projects involve multiple stakeholders. So whether that's local civil society organizations, government, investors, development partners, and others. And while they all often share similar ambitions to restore nature, each has different constraints. They may speak different languages. They're not necessarily familiar with each other. So we believe that building consensus, confidence, and trust among those different stakeholders will be both critical to project integrity as well as the long-term success of those projects. And it's definitely worth taking the time to do that and to get that right. I think a second lesson learned from our work is that everyone operating in this market, because we're still very much at the start of this journey, I would say, needs to share knowledge and expertise in order to scale. So we're working with our partners across NGOs, the public sector, investors, to build capacity, increase understanding, and share some of our knowledge about what's worked and what hasn't. And then I think the final lesson learned that I'd like to perhaps highlight today is the critical importance of the enabling environment for nature-based projects. So we see that the most developed natural capital markets today are those that have policy, regulation, or widely recognized standards and codes underpinning them. So we see a critical role for governments within the ASEAN region, working with scientific communities, working with other stakeholders knowledgeable about nature to set the right policy and regulatory environment within the region. So things like setting statutory targets for nature recovery can help mobilize more private capital, adjustments to tax treatments related to the use of land for nature and several other areas. And this, again, will be a critical enabler, I think, to unlocking more finance for nature and helping accelerate that shift we need to see.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It is truly relevant in that sense that not just the primary context that is important, but the enablers that you have rightly pointed out. Certainly regulatory targets are important. We will see increasingly more of those in the climate transition aspects when it comes to supporting the small medium enterprises. But less on the nature-based solution for smaller community or smaller businesses. So, Olivier, moving to you on S&P. S&P, one of the world-renowned entity, and now you have developed a number of tools. And in this context, we recently, I think, last couple of months, there was a launch of the nature risk profile with the United Nations WCMC to basically profile nature-related dependency and impacts. Right? So, and there are quite a number of tools out there also. And how would a financial institution be able to use such tool and not just financial institutions, but also companies as well?
Yeah, thanks. I think to address that, the bottom point, the key point is that it's incredibly complex to address nature in a financial context. There are what does it mean? Is it biodiversity? Is it impact? Is it dependency? Is it opportunity? So that's why it's an amazing endeavor to try and create a framework where we can capture those elements. And ideally, want to come back to your first point, in a way that is quantifiable, actually, which, again, allows to have some metrics. Quantifiable doesn't mean it's the truth. It means it gives you an actionable metric to guide action and to then monitor progress, right? And I wanted to come back also to what Gail was saying earlier, that I fully agree that there's no opposing human development and nature restoration, and all that is part of the same very complex, very granular, very layered approach. So in this approach we're putting forward, for example, what we're looking at, I'm going to take a concrete example, you're having impact of a mining development, so the nature impact. And, we're also looking into how that mining development could potentially lead to water pollution that would affect local communities, have then granular repercussion on, gender access to water, gender-specific access to water, to youth, to indigenous communities, and so on and so forth. So the idea is to get enough information to have a granular assessment of all the elements of nature. And the specificities of that tool that, as you mentioned, we've been developing with UNEP, WCMC, is to recognize that we really wanted to put forward a model where we want, as a private sector data provider, we want to partner and enhance and catalyze, what is already available on an open source basis through the UN agencies as well, and having that richness of information, wealth of information on biodiversity, and really working to the strength of each organization. So let me summarize, right? Let's say, S&P Global has a very unique asset specific database. They can, we can geolocalize, hundreds of thousands, millions of assets belonging and trace that to each companies. And what UNEP WCMC provides is the key biodiversity, the ecosystem relevance, the very specific information. Because at the end of the day, what we want when we're really looking at, again, massive flows of information, of financial data, and here this is something that is very relevant for ASEAN, in particular, right? We're speaking with ASEAN FI clients, which are interested to having that lens in their investment process, looking at all these flows of investment going to these and these and these companies. You need to be able to look at, it's not the same thing whether a company has plants which are in the middle of a protected forest or 10 kilometers down, down river where it's already urbanized. So you need to have something which is very, very granular. So that's really basically the approach to make sure you have something which is very layered, which is looking at not just one single indicator. Let's say, there are a couple of indicators available, species abundance indicators and concentration of species, not just looking at that, but looking at something which is a lot more ecosystem level. So what we call ecosystem integrity index, looking at structure, composition, function of an ecosystem, and then looking at the relevance of that ecosystem based on these very specific locations, and having a look at the interaction of the activity that had an impact with the very nature of that specific ecosystem in which that activity takes place, and then looking at the actual resilience of that ecosystem, so looking at the actual integrity of that ecosystem. So that's one example of how we, to approach nature and to have assessments which are meaningful. We need to have a wealth of data, a very rich, very layered approach in order to capture as much relevant information as possible, but still without getting drawn into information, making that information actionable. Again, the idea is to have, again, as TNFD, as for TCFD process, the idea is to have this information as a matrix for action and to mitigate and adapt and orient change from companies.
Yes, certainly the complexity of the ecosystem services from just valuation standpoint shouldn't hinder us from collecting data, whether it's location-specific data or data that are of interest to various stakeholders. So I think having more of these tools and data are a good step in the right directions. But there are still challenges that relates to the data points, where sometimes for users from the FIs and companies that are not specialists in biodiversity or nature, they might find it very difficult to integrate the link between species abundance or water stress, for example, with the business model and the economics or economic losses that the companies might face. So how would you address this aspect?
I mean, that's the nature of the model, and I would say that, so there are two angles to this. One is, so in terms of coverage, right? So before I answer that question, let me go to the first one, which is coverage and data quality in a way, right? So for all this approach, what's interesting is that often, being based in Singapore and speaking to ASEAN clients and more globally APAC, coverage is always a question. Having these new approaches, which are geospatial based, right? Where what you need is not ISIN, but coordinates of assets. And from there, you can have something which has that richness of, and you can cover 100% of an environment, of an investment universe or of a project or of anything, if you have the actual coordinates of the location you're interested in. So based on this, then, the whole strength of the model is to have impact functions, that's what we provide basically, how you translate from various approaches, various formulas from these approaches, let's say looking at impact. So we differentiate by impact and dependency, but translating the impact into basically a score, right? That gives you that assessment. Obviously, the goal at the end of the day, same we have for physical risk, in the TCFD framework. The idea is to translate that score, that estimation of an impact or a dependency into actual financial, dollar implication. Basically, but really what we wanted to make sure is to have that first comprehensive assessment. So, having a metric, which is, metrics are always imperfect per nature, but as long as you understand the metric, as long as you understand the methodology is transparent and we can trace it back to the actual location, then you have something which provides you a basis. Because again, if you want to have a target, if you want to assess progress and at systemic level, right, at macro level, looking at whole portfolios across, economies, then we need to have these indicators of progress, indicators of, status update, and how year on year we are moving on these indicators. And you can always discuss the indicators, but again, the net zero discussion for carbon, coming back to this one, has that simplicity of having that indicator. I'm not saying the indicator subsumes and the wealth and breadth and beauty of nature can be summarized to a figure, but for action in the, and when we want to divert billions of dollars of flow to nature positive investments, we need to have those indicators which are helpful for portfolio managers, for everyone involved in this industry, which has an influence to this massive flows.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the interest of time, allow me to summarize the key points, and I'll hand it over to Omar, the organizer. So if I can summarize, there are three main points. They are high level, but I think they are very useful. I think first, the importance of having a whole of society and whole of nature approach to things. There's a very complex problem that we're having, so all key stakeholders and functionality should work hand in hand. Number two, I think it's really important to address both the risks and the opportunities, but with the intent to capture both the nature and social dividend. And last but not least, while it's important to set targets, which we already have at the global level, having robust and credible metrics and supported by useful data and tools will help this target setting journey and also facilitate the progress of nature and nature finance. So with that, thank you so much to our esteemed panelists. With that, I will then close the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.